Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. Before I get started, please take a moment to subscribe down below. This is a magic and mentalism channel. I'm looking at all things magical, all things mentalism, the history, the current performing art, my own personal history. So if you're interested in magic, you're interested in mentalism, please subscribe and please comment. I'd love to hear from you. Today I would like to discuss what I consider to be the greatest magician most people have never heard of. I have a few interests, a lot of interests other than magic, and one of my interests is the Victorian period. I am a steampunk at heart. I'm a neo-Victorian at heart, and anything that has to do with the Victorian era, I am already in love with. Well, if you can tie magic into that, I'm really hooked. So when I discovered this person, I was just blown away by her story. And you know, here's the thing. There's a lot of magic tends to be a male-dominated art, especially in the Victorian period. It certainly was. That's changing. We have some women in the art today that are transforming the art entirely. I'm going to put some of their links below. I want you to take a look at them. Ekaterina, for example, and there are many, many others. But again, I'm going to put their links below. I want you to go take a look at them. But this particular person, her husband is in all the history books. If I take any one of my, and I got tons of them, if I pull any one of the history books off the shelf and flip through the period, you're going to see chapter after chapter on Alexander Hermann and his accomplishments. And that's great. But Alexander Hermann was married to a person named Adelaide Herrmann. And Addie, as she was called, went on to become a great performer in her own right. And so I want to share her story with you a little bit. I've got some cheat sheets right here. I want to get some dates right so that you know. Here's the short story, though. For 30 years, from 1896 until the time that she retired, and she retired 1928. So picture that. 1896 to 1928. She is a dominant force in the world of magic. One of the top, if not the top performer in that period. Now this was the Houdini period. This was the Blackstone period. And she's a dominant force in magic. Have you ever heard of Adelaide Herrmann? Probably not, and that's a shame. But you will today, and I'm going to share with you some resources. I want you to go and take a look at these resources, pick them up, get to know this person. She was the leading magician of her time, folks. Adelaide Herrmann. She was born August 11th, 1853 in London, England. All her life. Now, I can relate to her story. Most performers can. She gets the performance bug early. She doesn't get the magic bug like most of us did. She wants to be a ballerina or a dancer. So she gets the performance bug as a young child. She's sneaking off because she's afraid her parents aren't going to approve, right? So she's sneaking off to take lessons and prepare for the theater, and she gets this opera. She's good. She's getting that. Now, naturally, she's good because she's doing what she loves to do, right? If you do what you love to do, you're probably going to get good at it. So she loves to do this. She's out. She's working. She's studying, and she gets the opportunity to do it professionally. She's not an adult yet. So the company that she's working with wants to get her parents' permission. And she hasn't told her parents that she's doing it. So now she's got to go home and and asked for permission to go to America, from London to America, this little child. So there are certain qualifications, but her parents give her permission, and she goes on this American tour with this dance company. Years later, she's back home in London with the same dance troupe. She's taken a little bit of a break, and she goes to see Alexander Hermann. Now, what is the year that she sees him? I wonder if I wrote this down. Gosh, I'm not sure I did. Oh, yes, I did. Alexander Hermann is performing at the Egyptian Hall in London from 1871 to 1873. Now, this was before Alexander had a huge show. He was doing mostly manipulation, coin effects, billiard balls, this sort of thing. But he was a brilliant performer. He was certainly let's face it, Alexander Hermann was the greatest magician of his period, of his time. I think I can safely say that. He was the leading magician in the United States from the mid-1870s until he passed away in 1896. He was the leading magician in the United States. He would be the David Copperfield or the Criss Angel of his time. And a lot of the stereotypes that are associated with magic today came from Alexander Hermann. So here he is, this amazing personality. And this is, to be a superstar, let's face it, you need this charismatic personality. And so Alexander had this kind of a personality. Here is young Addie in the audience watching this magic show and being just overwhelmed by the beauty of the art. And she gets called up on stage, and so she assists Alexander in an effect at the Egyptian Hall. Let me give you a little bit. Let me just digress for a second here. The Egyptian Hall was constructed in Piccadilly, London in 1812, originally commissioned by William Bullock as a museum to house his collection. Now, I want you to imagine this. You've probably seen images of Victorian London. Yes, you've seen the large brownstones. So here you are, you're walking down a London street, you know, if you're a female, you're wearing your long Victorian gown. If you're a male, you're wearing evening dress, tails maybe with a top hat. And you're walking down the street in London, and you see brownstone, and then this Egyptian structure. I mean, it looked like a pyramid, you know, it had the Sphinx and everything else. So, it looked like a house of mystery. It doesn't exist anymore. But just try to imagine. It's 1871. And you're out for a stroll down a London street and you see this structure. Wouldn't you be curious, right? So it was the great Nevil Maskelyne who turned the Egyptian Hall into a house of magic. And I believe that his run, Nevil Maskelyne, he produced magic shows at the Egyptian Hall for 32 years. 32 years. And then the Egyptian Hall was torn down and they moved the House of Mystery to St. George's Hall. And St. George's Hall became very, very famous in posterity for magic and for magic history. Nevil Maskelyne, you know, I say that Alexander was the greatest magician of his time. Many people argue that John Nevil Maskelyne was the greatest magician of his time. David Devant. There's two different types of magicians. All right, there's the performer, and then there's the inventor. And sometimes they're the same, and sometimes they're not. I mean, David Copperfield relied on Jim Steinmeier, relying on Johnny Gahn. He was a performer. Johnny Gahn and Jim Steinmeier were creative geniuses, and they funneled a lot of material to David Copperfield. And generally speaking, the greats, the people that rise to dominance in in the art, aren't necessarily creating the effects. Now they're doing creative things with the effects, and I'll get to that in a second. But John Nevil Maskelyne was a genius. He created a lot of wonderful things, and so did David Devant. I'm not taking anything away from their performance style at all, but there was something special about Alexander Hermann. His dad was a magician. He was a physician, also a magician. Didn't want his sons pursuing the art. Two of his sons became professional magicians. Alexander was the most dominant. But I say that Alexander created a lot of the image of a magician that persists to this day. This particular book is called Adelaide Herrmann, Queen of Magic, her memoirs. By the way, the memoirs were lost for decades. Only recently have they been discovered, and still recently have they been published. This particular book, edited by Margaret Steele, Bramble Books, by the way. It was published, I'm looking for the date, 2012. Okay? So prior to 2012, Adelaide's memoirs were lost. She wrote them at the end of her career after 1928. She wrote them toward the end of her life. She passed away in February of 1932, so between 1928 and 1932, she wrote this material. And by the way, in the front, you get her memoirs. That is her recollections of her magical journey through life. In the back, you have essays that she wrote. Essays, a number of essays. You can see them right here. Find Mine, Find Madame Hermann's Ring, Madame Hermann's Jewels Recovered. So you have essays back here, a lot of really good stuff that she wrote, and other anecdotes about her life. But the dominant part of the book is her memoirs, and I can't recommend it more highly. This is a great read. It's as good as any biography I've ever read. It's if you love the Victorian period, if you love seeing what women did during the Victorian period, pick it up. If you love magic, pick it up. I'm going to talk a little bit about their contribution to magic, but Alexander Hermann was, this is Alexander right here, okay? Take a look at that. Look at his goatee. He wore evening dress on stage. He loved the idea of getting his secrets from a demonic source. I mean, he was certainly not a Satanist or anything like that, but he was a magician. But he loved the atmosphere of mystery that caused. And so a lot of the lithographs that you see coming in years later, where you see the little devil sitting on the magician's shoulder, whispering in his ear, came from Alexander. And the look of the goateed magician, I believe, came from Alexander. So I think a lot of the stereotype that persists to this day came from Alexander. So he's performing at the Egyptian Hall, and Addie is there with her friends, and she goes down and she does this performance with him, and then afterwards she goes backstage and she meets him. And you think that, reading the memoir, oh, this is how they met. Well, yeah, it's how they met, but she left the theater. He did this every night, several times a night, right? So as far as Alexander was concerned, it wasn't that significant for either one of them. Well, flash forward a little bit, and here they are now. She's with her dance company, and he is coming now from London to the United States for a United States tour, and they're sharing the same ship. So Alexander sees that she's there, and he asks her to join him, And back in those days, you didn't get aboard a plane and 6 hours later get off in the United States. You sailed across the sea, right? And it took some time, and so there was certainly time to develop a relationship, and so they did. And so they were married on March 27th of 1875 in New York City. And by the way, they lived in New York City. She retired in New York City. And so New York was very important to both of them. So they got married in 1875, and for the first few years of their performance together, she performed as a man. Yeah. She dressed in men's clothing. Let me see if I can find an image for you. I could not find this image anywhere else. I wish I could have, because I put it down below for you to see it, but it's in the book, page 34. She dressed in men's attire, and she performed under the name of Mr. Alexander. Now, she's learning magic. Okay, she hadn't done magic prior to this time. She's learning magic under the great Alexander, arguably the greatest magician of his time. She's learning. Now, they did, this is one of the reasons why I romantically look back on this period and wish that I had lived in the period and that I had the same opportunities. So he's out performing every single day, and she's working with him every day, and she's coming up to speed quickly, because you know what? You grow fast when you're in front of an audience. You really do, and she is, and their show is growing. So they started, now that he had Addie in the show, they started to add Grand Illusion. And one of the first things they did was called the aerial suspension. Now, the aerial suspension was invented by Robert Houdin. He is the father of modern magic. He was the first one to present magic in regular evening wear as the magician. He said that a magician is an actor playing the part of a magician. So that was a very modern approach to magic. And it was Robert Houdin. And Robert Houdin was a creative genius. And he invented the aerial suspension. Now, if you're not familiar with the aerial suspension, the way it's done today, it can be done with brooms, can be done with poles. The person who's going to be suspended stands on a stool, and she has sometimes brooms under her arms, sometimes poles, whatever. And Richie already did a wonderful version of this, by the way, where he did it with paper. So she's standing there and she's put in kind of a hypnotic trance, and then one of the poles is moved away, and she goes from a vertical position to a horizontal position. And now with Rich Yardy, when she came to and she stepped down off the platform, he tore the poles up because they were made of paper. Cool innovation. But this is an image. Now this image, it's available on the internet. I try to make sure that when I show an image and share an image, I have the right to do it. It's available in a lot of different places, but I found it in the Mike Cavaney collection, and I reached out to him, and I asked him if I could use it, and he said I could use it. So I'm gonna put a link to it below. But this is their aerial. Take a look at that. I'm telling you, that is the most beautiful aerial suspension I have ever seen. Now let me tell you something about the Hermanns, Addie and Alexander, and what they brought to magic. Magic, and to this day, it tends to be the case. It tends to be trick, trick, trick. Well, the Hermanns created vignettes around the effects that they did, very similar to what David Copperfield did. Now, I used to think David Copperfield was the first to do this. No. The Hermanns were the first to do this. They thought about what is the effect, and they created an entire play around that effect. And that play included light effects and a stage setting, so that you had different backdrops and different stage settings and different theatrical effects to support what was going on in the illusion. So that was pretty unique to the Hermanns at the time, and I think that's their I think that's their primary contribution to magic. Now, I could be wrong about that. You know, I don't claim to be a historian, but I can't recall reading about this type of presentation prior to the Hermanns. Just a fantastic thing. But what they did was they continued their basic show, and then they would add one illusion after another, and the show would get bigger and bigger and bigger. Of course, the late 1870s was the heyday of spiritualism. I am very pro-spiritualism. So when I see a magician exploiting spiritualism for their own personal gain, you know, no other religious faith would tolerate that. And I don't like that. I don't like that at all. And the Hermanns did a spirit cabinet effect. The reason I want to talk about their cabinet effect, once again, they didn't do just a spirit cabinet. They did an entire vignette. And when I read the description in here of their spirit cabinet effect, I realized that it was remarkably similar to the one David Copperfield did. If you go back and look at his special, I'm going to try to find the links. I'll put that below if I can find it. I don't know if I can, but I'll put it below if I can find it. You watch his spirit cabinet effect. It's not a condemnation of the religion of spiritualism, which I would really object to if they did it that way. I have issues with that. David Copperfield did not present it that way, and I don't think the Hermanns did either. They presented it as a theatrical experience, and people came to the theater wanting to see ghosts, right? So they would do the spirit effect, and spirits would fly out of the cabinet across the heads of the audience. That's exactly what David Copperfield did in his version. So I think when you look at David Copperfield's version, you're probably seeing something like what the Hermanns did way back in the 1870s and 80s. So think about it. If you can see David Copperfield's version and project yourself back into a gaslit theater, that's incredible stuff, man. That's incredible stuff. They also did a cremation illusion where Addie comes out and she's put into a casket and she's burned alive, right? And she comes back as a spirit. Later, after Alexander died, she did what's called the witch, where the witch was captured and she was burned at the stake and she comes back young. What a beautiful vignette. To take this, you know, the kind of a phoenix type of feel. So she comes out and she's burned, and you know there were laws against witchcraft for many years that were, I think in the 1950s, they were finally overturned, and it was recognized as a faith, as a religion. But prior to that time, there was a lot of superstition, and of course, sensitive performers kind of were hip to that anyway. So she comes and she portrays this as a regeneration type effect, phoenix type effect, which is beautiful. She did an effect called the Phantom Bride, which was a version of the Ajra. I've talked about that before. George Gobo, I saw him do it in a live theater, where a person's floating up under a shroud, and the shroud is pulled away and she vanishes and reappears somewhere else in the audience. Beautiful effect. They did that. Addie was also fired out of a cannon. That was one of their most sensational effects. She was, now, the way this happened, they had a stunt team working with them, and one of the things that they did was the human cannonball. So if you picture this, you got this huge net over here, and you got a cannon over here. Boom! The person is fired and they landed the net. Sensational effect. And that team left the show, and Alexander and Addie had people coming to see that because it was one of their sensations. So Addie stepped up to the plate. One of the things that impressed me in reading the memoir was the way Addie would step up and do things that you know, OSHA would have issues with today. I mean, she suffered some injuries, let me tell you. She was set on fire in the cannonball effect by accident. She fell off the stage. They were doing a number of times she fell off the stage and cracked her head and had various injuries. They were doing a Pepper's Ghost sort of effect, spirit. And this is one of the way that back in the day, spirit effects were created by the Pepper's Ghost principle. I don't want to reveal the principle here, but let me just tell you this. If you've ever been to Disney World or Disneyland, and you've gone through one of their rides where you see a spirit sitting next to you or spirits manifesting, that's the Pepper's Ghost principle. And you really see what appears to be a spirit manifesting, and it's a fantastic thing theatrically. And so they were doing this, and there was an accident, and she was nearly killed because of the weight of the glass that shattered around her. You know, magicians in this time, Harry Houdini especially, took chances, and they do today too. You can Google if you get an opportunity, or go on YouTube and take a look at some of the magician stunts gone wrong. It's scary stuff. There are still magicians today who do the buried alive illusion who don't quite make it. So, and the bullet catch, they did the bullet catch. Do you know how many magicians have died doing the bullet catch? I mean, it's a trick, but sometimes, you know what? I used to be a marksman. I'm a decorated marksman. I have awards and trophies and medals for competitions I've entered. And one of the things they teach you is respect for firearms. You do not stand in front of a firearm. It's just not a smart thing to do. And so a lot of magicians that have done this effect have been killed doing it. And Addie certainly objected. She objected when Alexander wanted to do it, but then later she did it. I'll get to that story in a second. So December 17th, 1896. They're in their private train car. And by the way, growing up, I was a fan of the Wild Wild West. James Gordon, Artemis, James West and Artemis Gordon. And if you remember the show, they used to travel around the country in a private train car. I used to think this was pure fantasy. So I'm reading this book, and sure enough, check that out. This is page 137 in the book. They have a private train car. So their show got so large and so successful that they were able to afford traveling around in a rail car. Now, that's a picture of the outside of the rail car right there. On the next two pages, you have Addie's rail car chamber, and then this is their this is the interior part of their rail car, and this part down here is one of Alexander's parts of the car. But they had their own very plush, very steampunk, very Victorian train car that they traveled the country in. Awesome stuff, man. So they have the most successful show in the United States, possibly in the world. They've toured the world, and by the way, Addie and her husband Alexander are bilingual. They speak many languages, and so they're able to go to countries where other magicians can't go because they can speak the language. But he passes away suddenly. At the height of his career, he passes away. They've got, I don't know how many people were in their company, but they had a tour. You know the old adage, the show must go on. So he was billed to do the bullet catch. And audiences were expecting to see the bullet catch. And he's dead. He died. And, you know, Addie, imagine being in love with a human being, another human being, and you're married to this person and they suddenly die. I can't imagine anything more difficult than that moment. But Addie, despite her grief, and she grieved for her husband for the rest of her life, as we all do, when we lose someone we love, you don't get over that. People say time heals. You go on, but you don't get over it. And so Addie didn't get over losing her husband, But here she is just a couple of months. Let's see, he dies in December 17th. On January 19th, 1897, less than a month later, right? She's doing the bullet catch in front of a firing squad at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City, where they were built to do this. So rather than let her company down, rather than let her audience down, Addie grieves privately, and she goes on with the show. Victorians, you know, they had a sense of duty, they had a sense of honor, and it comes across in this book, her integrity, her work ethic, her devotion to her husband and to her company and to the art. I admire that so much. It's one of the things I admire about the Victorian period is their sense of propriety. I just love it. There's honor, there's goodness in that. And so she goes on with the show, and she stands in front of a firing squad, knowing that so many performers before her have died doing this, and she catches the bullet. Fantastic stuff. Fantastic stuff. For a brief period of time, she gets a relative of Alexander, Leon, to come with the show. He doesn't work out. They tour together for 3 seasons before Leon eventually leaves the show, and she goes on. She goes on to perform from 1896, when Alexander passes, to the time she retires in 1928. About a 30-year period where she is a dominant force in magic in the United States. Now, there's a video. If you scroll down in my history, you'll see a video on Victoria Woodhull, known affectionately as the Queen Victoria of the United States. Victoria ran for president against Ulysses S. Grant. People don't know that. People think Hillary Clinton was the first. Victoria Woodhull was the first, decades before women had the right to vote. And so at a time when social standards were such that women didn't have opportunities, she's the dominant force in magic for 30 years. Think about that. Think about that. She's interviewed in November 2nd of 1899, an article for Broadway magazine entitled "The World's Only Woman Magician." And she says in this article, I want to quote this, "I shall not be content until I am recognized by the public as a leader in my profession, and entirely irrespective of the question of sex." In other words, I don't want to be known as the only woman magician. I want to be known as the world's greatest magician. Adelaide Herrmann. And she was. She didn't just stop. She didn't just do the Alexander show after his passing. She continued to innovate. She continued to bring her personality to that show. Look, take a look at this. Adelaide Herrmann and Company. Where pictured here is a woman getting her head cut off, put on a pedestal, and then restored back again. Adelaide Herrmann. This is Addie doing billiard ball manipulations. She was proficient in every kind of magic that there is. She did grand illusion. She did manipulations. She did a wonderful act. She was a great performer. You never heard of her, have you? Check her out, folks. Alexander Hermann, Addie Herrmann. This particular book here, Anything But Ordinary. Addie, the true story of Adelaide Herrmann, Queen of Magic. This obviously is a children's book, but it's not a children's book. This tells the story. This tells the story of Adelaide Herrmann in a visual way. This tells us this is her as a little child, studying dance, becoming an acrobat and dancer in the theater, going on to meet to meet Alexander and become part. She was on her way to America when she meets Alexander. And so it tells the story. It tells the story of Addie. I mean, the artwork in here is if you don't know anything, if you don't like magic history, and you don't care anything about Addie, the artwork in here is worth having all by itself. So go out and buy this book. Do it. I mean, you won't regret it. Anything But Ordinary, the Addie Hermann story, fantastic. But this is the book I really want to promote here. Adelaide Herrmann, Queen of Magic, the memoirs. This book reads like a great novel. Addie wrote her, it's written first person. These are her recollections, these are her thoughts, these are her experiences, and you will re-experience magic in the Victorian period like no other book I've ever read. So pick this up, read it, you won't regret it. Addie passed away on February 19th of 1932, leaving behind her a legacy that I hope more people learn about, more people appreciate. I mean, you've heard about Alexander, you've heard about Houdini, you've heard about Thurston and Blackstone. Now hear about Adelaide Herrmann, Addie Hermann, the world's greatest magician. Thank you for watching.